is Emily Talbot, and I am the Chief Curator of the Norton Simon Museum. In 2018 through 2019, we had the pleasure of collaborating with the Department of Paintings Conservation at the J. Paul Getty Museum to clean and conserve the Simon's 3 paintings by Édouard Manet, part of a long-standing conservation agreement between our 2 institutions. To learn more about the experience of working on these paintings, I called Devi Ormond, Associate Conservator of Paintings at the Getty, who treated the artist's portrait of his wife, Madame Manet, probably dating to the mid-1870s. Though unfinished, this picture is one of Manet's most sensitive depictions of Suzanne Leenhoff, a Dutch pianist whom he wed in 1863, and whose gentle demeanor pervades each of the 6 portraits he painted of her during their marriage. By removing the discolored varnish and gratuitous retouching on Madame Manet, which was probably employed to disguise a minor crack along the subject's cheek, Devi was able to restore the painting's original palette, as well as Manet's lively, sketch-like handling of paint in the figure and background. This newly revealed surface better situates the Simons portrait in dialogue with 2 related paintings of Suzanne Manet, Madame Édouard Manet at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Portrait of Madame Manet in the Conservatory at the National Museum for Art, Architecture, and Design in Oslo, Norway. Comparing before and after images of Madame Manet, the results of this treatment are really quite astonishing. Devi, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience of conserving this picture. Can you start by telling us a bit about the condition of the painting when it arrived in your studio?
This particular painting of Madame Manet really caught my eye, and initially it was to do with her grubby appearance. Really an astounding painting, very sketchy in its facture, but it just seemed to have a kind of a slightly off yellowy appearance that didn't really depict what Manet was doing at this time, using the cool colors and the cool grays that he was using, and also his technique of creating these paintings in a sketchy manner. And this painting, I believe, was never intended to be exhibited as a completed work.
So understanding the status of the picture, as well as its original state, is an important way to differentiate the artist's intentions for the work from any interventions that may have occurred after it was made. Can you tell us what procedures you used to evaluate this and how you assessed the retouching that have been employed in this portrait?
One of the things that we do on examining the painting, it's non-invasive, is that we look at the painting in ultraviolet light. And when you look at this image, the 2 beside each other, where on the left we have an image of her as we would see her in normal light, and on the right we have the image of her in ultraviolet light. And it looks quite different. This retouching around her face that really, in terms of color, did not seem to match, again, with the adjacent brushwork, and it made me think that it was non-original.
Yes, and the UV light also reveals how extensive the retouching is, modifying the shape of Madame Manet's face, as well as filling in the background of the picture. Do you have a sense what this retouching was trying to achieve?
In this particular case, I would say the painting was unfinished. It's probable, we have no factual evidence that it was the case, but it was probably made to look a little bit more completed as a composition. So one of the things that Manet, in his technique of painting, is that he tends to have very, very thinly painted backgrounds. And the areas which look grubby in the background might have been added to sort of fill out that sketchy paintwork. Similarly, in the lower part of the painting. And then, interestingly, the disturbing retouching on the face, it might be covering some sort of damage.
Right. And I know that your study of the picture under infrared light, which allows us to see below the surface of the painting, was very helpful in identifying this damage and offering some explanation for why the figure's face was so generously retouched. Because looking at the technical photography, it's really pretty shocking to see how freely Manet was painted over.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that when we had looked at the painting in infrared, we didn't see areas that were damaged that correspond to the extent of the retouching that we're seeing here. All we saw, if you remember, and if we zoom in on the infrared reflectogram, is just a very, very thin horizontal crack. You can see in the ultraviolet light that his this thin dark line, that it seems to correspond to the crack. All the other retouching that we're seeing around her face, there doesn't seem to be any damage underneath. My inclination is to think that this crack may have occurred as a result of the secondary support onto which the canvas is attached. So canvases, as you all well know in paintings, they're attached to supports known as stretchers or strainers. And in this case, the horizontal member of that stretcher seems to have caused a horizontal crack.
I see. So presumably the retouching was intended to disguise this minor crack. But as you pointed out, the retouched areas were visibly different in color to the original paint. Can you tell us what's happened here?
Well, I think time has played a huge part in this, and not to mention the choice of materials used by perhaps a restorer or even another artist who was trying to make this painting look more complete. My indication is to think that the type of material used has aged in a way that has caused the binding medium, probably the oil, to darken. And this has become a lot more obvious over time. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, the original paint used by Manet has not seemed to change in any significant way, so that we do start to see a real shift in color and in tonality between what was carried out by Manet and what was carried out by a restorer or another artist. Mm-hmm. And that becomes very obvious, particularly when you look at the painting in ultraviolet light, that these areas of retouching do correspond to this dark area that we're looking in when we see the UV light.
It must have been really satisfying to remove this discolored retouching and restore the painting to its original appearance.
It really beautifully, it came off very, very easily, and we were all completely taken aback how well preserved the original paint was. It was just astounding. And it was so rewarding to know that we were removing this discolored retouching and exposing, the exquisite, gentle touch of Manet's portrait. And, it really crossed this sensitivity, of him painting this sketchy portrait of his wife. There was something incredibly endearing and intimate about it. So it really gave the painting a completely different emotional relationship with the viewer, I feel. Mm-hmm.
That really resonates with me. And I completely agree that removing the discolored additions reestablished the painting's freshness and intimacy. We really see it in an entirely new light. And I think your art historical research has played a role in this as well. We've long known that our painting bears a close relationship to the Met portrait of Madame Manet, based on the similar gray garment that the subject is wearing in both pictures, as well as the sketch-like handling of the backgrounds. And of course, there's that wonderful detail of the hat, which appears so prominently on Suzanne Manet's head in the Met painting, but was painted out in the Simon version, and now is best seen under infrared light. But one detail I was not attuned to are these horizontal lines adjacent to Madame Manet's shoulder and arm, and what they might suggest about the relationship between our portrait and a more fully realized painting like Portrait of Madame Manet in the Conservatory. Do you have any thoughts about this?
I do. I was always kind of confused as to why they were there. And again, this is the beauty and joy of talking to other conservators and art historians. And I was in New York talking to Charlotte Hale, the conservator at the Met, and it was she who pointed out to me, she drew my attention to these lines and connected it to the Oslo portrait as possibly being indications of the bench on which he was sitting, which you see in the Oslo painting.
Yes, it's a wonderful detail, and one that I'd overlooked for years until you drew my attention to it. Devi, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me and for offering us some insights into the experience of conserving Madame Manet. We're so proud to return the portrait to the galleries in such splendid conditions, and I look forward to sharing it with our visitors in the years ahead.